I had always been the black sheep of my family. It wasn't that I wanted to be rebellious, it just seemed that no matter what I did, it was never good enough for them. My father, a prominent businessman, always told me to stay in the background, to blend in, to not make waves. And my mother, she was the picture of grace and composure, so different from me. I was the loud one, the one who questioned things, who thought that just because something was tradition, didn't mean it was right. This time, however, it wasn't just a typical warning. It was a threat, direct and clear. "Don't embarrass us, not at the wedding." My father's voice rang in my head as I sat in the car, heading toward the venue. "This is your sister's big day, and we can't afford any drama. Do you understand?" My hands tightened around the steering wheel, the leather creaking beneath my fingers. I took a deep breath and tried to steady myself. My sister's wedding was supposed to be the highlight of our family's year, and apparently, my mere presence was seen as a potential disaster. I couldn't help but feel a flicker of resentment. It wasn't that I didn't love my sister. On the contrary, I adored her, but everything surrounding the wedding felt wrong. My family was more concerned with appearances than actual emotions. They had hired a famous chef to cater the event, someone who had the reputation of preparing the finest seafood dishes in the world. And yet, as I stood at the edge of the kitchen, watching the staff prepare the banquet, I felt a nagging sensation in my gut that something wasn't quite right. "You'll do great," my sister had told me earlier, giving me a hug and telling me I could be her maid of honor if I could keep my temper in check for just one day. As I walked through the grand hall, the shimmering chandeliers and the polished marble floor reflected my anxiety. Everything seemed perfect on the surface. The flowers, the elegant sea blue theme, the way the guests were laughing and mingling like they were part of a grand, never-ending celebration. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something dark was lurking underneath the surface, waiting to rear its ugly head. It wasn't long before I learned what it was. The caterer had outdone himself with a lavish seafood platter, filled with lobster, shrimp, oysters, and crab. The guests were raving about the food, savoring every bite as if it were a rare treat. But I noticed something that everyone else seemed to ignore, a faint odor that lingered in the air. I moved closer, trying to pinpoint the smell. Something about it made my stomach turn. As I glanced over at the seafood station, my gaze fell on the chef. He looked distracted. And then it hit me, he wasn't just distracted, he was nervous. I had no concrete evidence, no clear reason to believe anything was wrong. But my instincts were screaming at me. My family had always taught me to ignore my instincts, to ignore that nagging feeling inside and trust the polished exterior. But this time I couldn't do it. I couldn't just sit back and pretend everything was fine. The evening was going smoothly. Or at least that's what everyone thought. The guests were enjoying themselves, sipping champagne, laughing, and taking selfies under the twinkling lights. My mother, ever the social butterfly, was busy mingling, and my father was engaged in a conversation with some business partners. Meanwhile, I was standing by the seafood station, pretending to be engrossed in the lively conversations happening around me. But my mind was racing. I kept thinking about the smell that had briefly caught my attention earlier. I excused myself from a group of guests and made my way back to the kitchen. I had to know if I was just being paranoid or if something was truly wrong. The kitchen staff was bustling about, preparing the final courses for dinner. The head chef was at the center, barking orders, but his movements seemed hurried, almost frantic. "Excuse me," I called out, my voice trembling slightly. But I couldn't stop myself. "Is everything okay with the seafood?" The head chef looked up, startled. Yes, of course. Everything is perfectly fine." I didn't believe him. My gaze shifted to the massive pots of lobster and crab, which were still steaming under the heat lamps. There was a peculiar sheen to them that didn't look quite right. My eyes narrowed as I stepped closer to the table. "You're sure about this?" I pressed, my heart pounding in my chest. "This is the freshest seafood, right?" The chef hesitated for a moment before giving me a tight smile. "Of course. Just a little more time under the heat lamps, and they'll be ready to serve." Something in the way he said it sent a chill through my spine. I stood there for a moment considering my options. Then I did what I never thought I would. I reached for one of the lobster tails and gave it a closer look. Something was off. The texture was wrong, and there was a faint discoloration near the tail. My stomach twisted. The panic in my chest grew. Before I could stop myself, I took a quick glance around. There were 200 guests, and no one knew what was happening behind the scenes. The seafood was being devoured in large quantities, and I could see the subtle changes in the guests' faces. A few had already begun to sweat, their faces flushed with an odd redness. I needed to act, and I needed to act fast. The realization hit me hard. Something was terribly wrong, and I had no time to waste. My mind raced as I scanned the room, trying to stay calm and figure out what to do next. The guests were still chatting, laughing, unaware that their lives might be in danger. The seafood platter had been a hit, but it was now my responsibility to make sure it didn't turn into a disaster. I turned to leave the kitchen, but I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that hung over me like a thick fog. My eyes darted around as I made my way back to the dining hall, looking for someone I could trust. My sister was talking to a group of bridesmaids, looking radiant in her wedding dress. She had no idea that this moment, the happiest day of her life, might soon be overshadowed by tragedy. I found my mother near the bar, her face beaming with pride. Her eyes met mine, and for a moment I wanted to shout at her, to tell her everything that was going wrong, to tell her about the seafood and the strange smell. But I couldn't do that. Not yet. Not without proof. Instead, I quietly leaned in and whispered, "Mom, something's wrong with the food. I think it's the seafood. I don't know what's going on, but we need to stop serving it immediately." Her eyes widened, and for a split second, she looked at me with disbelief. "What are you talking about? The food is perfect. Everything is going according to plan." "I'm serious," I pressed. "The chef is acting weird, and I think some of the seafood is bad. We need to find out if anyone's getting sick." My mother's face softened, but I could see the hesitation in her eyes. She didn't want to believe me. She didn't want to ruin the perfect night. I grabbed her arm gently, pulling her closer. "Please just trust me. Look at the guests. Some of them are already starting to feel off. You can't ignore it." She glanced around the room, her eyes scanning the guests. And that's when she saw it, the faint flush on the faces of a few people who had eaten the seafood. She nodded slowly, her face turning pale. "All right," she whispered. "I'll have the staff start checking on things." I watched her hurry off to speak with the catering staff, and for the first time that evening, I felt a sense of urgency. I had to act quickly. I couldn't let my family's image or reputation get in the way of saving those guests. I couldn't let anyone else eat that seafood. Not when I knew something was wrong. It didn't take long before the first signs of sickness became apparent. First, it was subtle. A guest would clutch their stomach, a look of discomfort spreading across their face. Then a few others followed suit. Someone nearby coughed violently, and a loud voice called for water. The air in the room began to shift, and what was once a cheerful celebration turned into an atmosphere filled with tension. I could feel it now, the panic setting in. The happy chatter of the guests had quieted, and some of them were beginning to look around, confused and concerned. My heart raced as I spotted a few more guests starting to sweat, their faces turning a strange shade of red. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the realization that nobody knew how to stop this. I had no proof that the seafood was poisoned, and even if it was, who could I turn to? The chef had already denied any problems, and with no clear signs of contamination, how could I convince anyone to stop the meal before it was too late? I felt my hands shake as I approached one of the waiters, a young man who had been serving drinks earlier in the evening. "Did you notice anything unusual with the seafood?" I asked in a low voice. He looked at me nervously. I don't know. Some of the guests have been asking for more water, but no one's complained about the food." "Why?" "I think the seafood is bad," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "We need to stop serving it. Now." His eyes darted nervously toward the kitchen. "But we can't just." "I'm not asking you to stop everything," I said, my voice hardening. "Just take the remaining seafood off the tables." Right now. I could see the internal struggle on his face, but after a moment, he nodded and hurried off to the kitchen. It wasn't enough, though. Not nearly enough. I needed to get to the heart of this before it spiraled further out of control. I couldn't just sit back and wait for someone else to figure it out. I had to know for sure if the seafood had been tampered with, if someone had deliberately poisoned the guests, or if it was just an accident. But who could I turn to for answers? The chef clearly wasn't going to help. And with the wedding in full swing, no one else seemed willing to listen. I decided to investigate on my own. First, I went back to the seafood station. The heat lamps had been switched off, but the smell was still there, faint but lingering. I examined the platters closely, running my fingers over the crustaceans. There was nothing visibly wrong, but then I remembered what I had seen earlier, the chef's nervous energy, the way he seemed distracted when I asked him about the food. As I moved around the station, something caught my eye. A small vial tucked away behind the stacks of seafood trays. Froze. My heart skipped a beat as I reached for it, pulling it out carefully. It was labeled in tiny print. Toxin solution, use with caution. This was no accident. Someone had intentionally poisoned the seafood. My blood ran cold as I realized the gravity of the situation. If I didn't act fast, I could be the only one who stood between life and death for 200 innocent guests. I knew what I had to do. I couldn't let this go any further. There was no way I was going to stand by while my family and guests were unknowingly poisoned. This was my chance to take control, not just of the wedding, but of the danger that was silently creeping through the venue. I started by discreetly warning a few guests. I didn't want to cause a scene, but I needed to get the word out before it was too late. If you've eaten the seafood, you might want to get checked by the staff, I told one of the bridesmaids, who looked at me with concern. What's wrong? Is something wrong with the food? She asked. I don't know yet, but just stay on the safe side. I kept moving through the crowd, repeating the same message to anyone who had eaten the seafood. Slowly but surely word spread, and people began to realize the seriousness of the situation. The chaos started to unfold. Guests began to panic, some of them calling for help, others rushing to the bathroom. The air was thick with tension as the reality set in. The wedding was quickly spiraling into something unrecognizable. But my mind was clear. I wasn't going to let anyone else suffer because of this. I had to find the culprit. I had to expose them no matter the cost. The chaos in the hall escalated faster than I could manage. Guests were stumbling, holding their stomachs, and some even collapsed to the floor, their faces pale as they vomited violently. The once celebratory atmosphere had now turned to one of panic. The air was thick with confusion and fear. I was doing my best to keep calm, even though my mind was racing. Every instinct screamed that we needed to act fast. It was only a matter of time before the situation would spiral even further out of control. I moved through the guests, trying to help those who were in distress. But there was only so much I could do. I wasn't a doctor. I didn't have the training to handle a poisoning emergency. The only thing I could do was keep trying to warn as many people as possible and keep them away from the remaining food. I couldn't help but glance back at the seafood station, where the staff were still trying to clear the remaining platters from the tables. The chef was nowhere to be found, and that only deepened my suspicions. He had to know something about this. I found my mother, who was now visibly shaken, trying to console some of the guests. She looked at me with wide eyes, her voice frantic. I knew something was wrong. Why didn't you tell me sooner? She whispered, her face ashen. I tried to warn you, I replied quietly, grabbing her arm. It's not too late, but we need to get everyone to a hospital. We need to act fast. She nodded, her eyes filled with terror. I'll take care of the guests. You find the chef. I knew if I was going to get any answers, I had to find the chef. He had to be involved in some way, either directly or indirectly. The vial I found earlier was too much of a clue to ignore. But where was he? I started searching the hall, walking through the kitchen entrance, and pushing past staff who were rushing to manage the increasingly desperate situation. The venue was starting to feel like a pressure cooker, and I was the one who had to keep it from exploding. I headed to the back rooms, a maze of corridors that led to staff-only areas. There were several catering staff members huddled in one of the rooms, looking at the phones. When they saw me, their expressions immediately turned to fear. "Where is the chef?" I demanded. "I need to talk to him now." One of the servers pointed toward the far corner of the room, where a door led to the private staff area. Without another word, I stormed over and pushed open the door, my heart pounding in my chest. There he was, the chef. His face was pale, and he was standing in front of a small table, fumbling with a cell phone, looking completely disoriented. "I knew something was wrong with the seafood," I said, my voice shaking with fury. "You poisoned them, didn't you?" The chef flinched, his eyes darting toward me. No, it wasn't supposed to be like this," he muttered, his hands trembling. "What do you mean? What the hell is going on?" I demanded, stepping closer. "What did you do?" He let out a shaky breath, and for the first time I saw the fear in his eyes. "I didn't mean for it to happen. The order. The seafood, it was supposed to be a test. A simple plan to ruin the wedding. Just to get back at your family. But I didn't mean for anyone to get hurt." "Who told you to do this?" I asked, a sense of cold realization creeping into my bones. "Who put you up to this?" The chef looked at me, his eyes haunted. "I was paid to ruin the wedding. They said it would be a simple thing. No one would know. They said it was just a small dose, just enough to ruin the evening, to cause a little chaos. But I didn't realize how bad it would get. I swear I never wanted anyone to get hurt." I stared at the chef, my stomach turning with disgust. I had suspected something bigger was at play, but hearing it from him confirmed my worst fears. Someone had orchestrated this. Someone with a vendetta against my family. But who? I pressed the chef further. "Who paid you? Who told you to do this?" His voice shook. "I can't say. They'll kill me if I do. But it wasn't just about the wedding. It was personal. They wanted to ruin everything. Your family's reputation. Your father's business. It was revenge." I could feel my blood boil. Revenge. For what? What had my family ever done to deserve this kind of attack? I grabbed him by the shoulders, my eyes narrowing. "You have to tell me. I need a name. You have to help me stop this." He looked around nervously, his lips trembling as he whispered, "It was your uncle. Your father's brother. He promised me money. Enough to make everything go away if I did this for him." My head spun. My uncle. He had always been distant, but I never would have imagined he was capable of something like this. "I knew it," I whispered, stepping back. "I knew there was something wrong about this family. You're telling me my own uncle wanted to destroy us?" The chef nodded weakly, his face pale with fear. "You've got to help me stop this," I said, taking a deep breath. "We need to get everyone to safety. You'll never be able to run from this." By the time I returned to the main hall, things had gone from bad to worse. The guests who had eaten the seafood were now in various stages of distress. Some had been taken away in ambulances. Others were sitting in chairs, pale and sweating, still unsure of what had happened. My mother was speaking with paramedics, and I could see the growing sense of urgency on her face. I felt a rush of guilt. She had tried to warn me, but I hadn't listened in time. We were in a race against the clock, and I was determined to make sure my uncle paid for what he had done. I grabbed my phone and dialed the police. "You need to get here now. We've had a poisoning at my family's wedding. It's bad, very bad."